Our second speaker is Carolyn Dowdell. Carolyn is a PhD candidate in the Art History Department here at Queen's University. The focus of her study is the social history and intersections of women's dress, construction, and consumption in 18th century England. Her current work is an extension of her MA research, which she completed at the University of Alberta. Carolyn volunteered with a collection of Canadian historical dress housed in the Agnes Etherington Art Centre over several years, and thus became acquainted with the sub-collection of Agnes Etherington's clothing. This work culminated in Carolyn guest curating an exhibition on the subject at the Art Centre, which ran from June to November in 2014. The title of the paper Carolyn is presenting today is Her Love of Fine Clothes, Self-Representation, and the Fashions of Agnes Etherington. Please welcome Carolyn. Thank you, Carolyn.
All right, hello, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and let's get right to it. Agnes Etherington's primary and best-known legacy is her many contributions to the arts in Kingston, and particularly here at Queen's University. She founded the beginnings of an art library here, donated the Constantine collection of Northern Indigenous art, and foremost among her contributions was the gift of her very own house, her lifelong home from birth in 1880 to her passing in 1954. And it became the location of the beginnings of today's art center, which has now grown and expanded onto it in a really fascinating, sort of way. So the beginnings of the Art Center, which is so very aptly named for her today. The gradual buildup of a collection of her clothing from throughout her life is another legacy, as valuable as it was and unanticipated. The Art Center holds approximately 25 pieces from Etherington's wardrobe in the collection of historic Canadian dress, spanning primarily the first half or third of the 20th century. My presentation today comes out of an examination of her life through her clothing, with which I intermittently worked for several years as a volunteer and practicum student, and from which I guest curated the exhibition that was mentioned in the introduction. Unfortunately, specific information about much of her clothing, such as who made it and for what particular events and contexts, is largely lacking. In most instances, we must let the clothing pieces themselves do the talking. However, this very lack of information, and particularly lack of labels within most of the clothing that we have of hers, combined with our knowledge of her elite status within Kingston. She was a daughter of the prominent Richardson family, who were sort of big business and industry family here in Kingston. They got involved in agricultural transportation. The company still exists, but based out of Winnipeg today. So she was a prominent member of elite Kingston society. Combine that with the lack of sort of, labels inside her clothes, we can presume that most of it was custom made. And so this then likely entailed collaboration between Etherington and her dressmaker or dressmakers to build her desired sartorial image. Thus, they tell us about her personal tastes and the kind of person she fashioned herself to be. They tell us that she enjoyed femininity, the exotic and luxurious, and that she cultivated a stately self-image in her later years. As we'll see, they also show us that while she certainly had a love of fine clothes, she was not necessarily a slave to fashion. As such, I have then organized my talk along these themes of femininity, exoticism, luxury, and stateliness, roughly corresponding them with the chronology of her life, although there is occasional jumping back and forth. So to begin, we start at almost the beginning of Agnes's life. So on the left, we have the image of a wool outfit that was believed to be hers as an infant or a toddler. And it is made of wool and it's hand embroidered in silk. It's a dress and a cape in a very saturated coral color. This is one of the pieces in the collection. And I like to think that it presages a colorful life. On the right hand, we see a picture. This is a photograph of Agnes at around, I think it's around the age of 8. She's obviously a well-cared for and well-dressed child in a fashionable little girl's dress of the 1880s. Jumping forward a few years at the end of her sort of formative education, she spent a year in Italy studying art and music. And this is described in a speech that was given by her niece, Agnes Benedictson, who was the first female chair at Queen's University. And so on the 100th anniversary of Agnes's birth, there was a big to-do, and Agnes Benedictson gave a speech about her aunt, and there's a little blurb about her year spent in Italy. And it reads, "After her schooling was completed, her parents agreed to send my aunt to Italy to study art. She spent an unforgettable year in Florence, after which she was fetched home, much against her wishes, because close friends of her parents, who lived only a few houses away, dropped in almost daily to warn her mother of the evils that could befall a young lady living alone in Italy." Although their friendship continued, I think Aunt Agnes never quite forgave that family for causing the cutting short of her intended 3-year stay in Florence. So despite her parents' ultimate concession to social convention, obviously their liberal-minded attitude towards their daughter's upbringing and encouragement of her artistic sensibilities no doubt greatly influenced the woman and the type of dresser she became. This is a tea gown from the first decade of the 20th century. It is the earliest garment in the collection from Agnes's adulthood, worn when she would have been in her 20s. It is a highly fashionable, though informal garment worn about the house and to receive visitors who were intimate with the family. Agnes would have been corseted underneath this to mold her figure to the fashionable hourglass silhouette. The embroidery is hand-wrought, and the workmanship of the sewing is most fine. And yes, and I subsequently, upon even closer examination, determined that all of the sewing on this dress is by hand. Even though machine sewing was very common by this time, this dress is entirely hand-sewn. So that really demonstrates the elite level of this piece. Very fine fabric, fine laces, entirely hand-sewn. So the garment reflects the Richardson family's established position of high status within Kingston, forged by Agnes's grandfather, an Irish immigrant tailor turned businessman in the mid-19th century. Here we have something a little even less formal and a little more intimate. This is a nightgown and cape from the 1910s or 20s. Very delicate colors, very delicate materials. The cape that's on the right-hand side that would have been worn over the nightgown, it's in this this whisper-thin chiffon, silk chiffon, that's so floaty. It's soft, yet there's a somewhat dynamic color combination between, with the lavender and the aqua. It's not, it's a visually interesting color combination rather than, just pairing it with white or cream or something like that. Two more examples. There's a 1920s embroidered and beaded net jacket on the left, and a 1900s to 1910s linen and lace jacket. So again, there's these sort of delicate elements to them, despite being from somewhat different aesthetic and stylistic periods. So you've got this lightweight net. I mean, the beaded jacket was so lightweight and so delicate we could not put it on display. And then the lace work on the jacket on the right, again, is very, this very delicate, feminine sort of feel. This is a portrait of Agnes Etherington from probably around about the time period that we've covered so far. It's an overall soft sort of image, fits in with this sort of delicate, it's a sort of a delicate touch. And Agnes was a woman of I mean, she almost imposing stature. She was almost 6 feet tall. And so a woman of, with that kind of a physical presence, dressing in these light and delicate, feminine clothes and textiles, it really, that's very evocative to me. So now we move into, where am I? Eastern Exoticism. Beginning in 1910, a great change in women's fashion arose, largely driven by French designer Paul Poiret, who in turn was heavily influenced by the then popular ballet russe costumes designed by Léon Bakst and Eastern Exoticism. This idea of Eastern Exoticism encompassed the sense of romance and mystery of the Orient, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East, and evoked images of richly colored silks patterned with gold or silver, flowing drapery, ornate embellishment, and a certain artful haphazardness and asymmetry of design. We have a ballet russe sketch by Bakst on the right-hand side and an illustration of Poiret designs from around about 1910. So here we have an evening gown from 1912 of Agnes's, showing that it appears she found this trend highly appealing. This dress is at the height of fashion for the time that it was made, constructed of sumptuous materials, silk satin, gold and black laces, and gold lame. We can see that she really enjoyed this idea of the artful dishevelment and asymmetry, and it's almost a little bit unfortunate that we can't see the back of it because it's got this kind of crazy train that weaves in and out of itself. So this very artistic, really interesting and really almost kind of funky assemblage of a design, really referencing this overall, feeling of this Eastern exoticism kind of aesthetic. These are photos of Agnes at her sort of family's country estate of Fettercairn, which is up the Rideau Canal system. These were taken around about 1916. At that time, Agnes had made Fettercairn into an institution, or she instituted a convalescent home for soldiers who were shell-shocked during World War I at Fettercairn. She brought her taste for the exotic with her. She apparently liked to dress up for picnics. She was very involved in the goings-on in life and activities at Fettercairn. Her brother had served in World War I, and he died in 1916, so I think this must have been a very personal thing for her to set up, and so an important thing for her to be involved with. So she was very active there and spent a lot of time at the different activities and events they would hold there, and spending time with the soldiers. And she liked to have picnics there. And so both of the dresses there's two different dresses. I guess they're a little bit tricky to see in this lighting. They're not the same, but they are similar. Both of them appear to be made of a silk with a spotted fabric design that really reminds me of Indian saris. And her dedication and her obvious love of this, I think, is demonstrated by the fact that she's sitting on the ground in these, narrow silhouetted dresses to eat her lunch on a picnic blanket, and these dresses are just not conducive to doing that at all. I mean, in the photo on the right, you can almost kind of see that it's kind of awkward for her seated on the ground in this dress, but obviously she was determined. This is her taste for this type of exoticism took a more literal form as well, as seen with this early 20th century kimono. This would have been worn as a form of loungewear inside the home only. Was most likely made for the Western market, as a close examination of it reveals it's a blending of both Chinese and Japanese components. So the style of the garment is Japanese in the kimono style, but the pattern of the silk design, or the pattern of the silk textile, is actually it's a jacquard of Chinese dragons. And the silk embroidery, while it attempts to look more Japanese, it's not entirely convincing, and the types of threads are ones that you more often see on sort of antique Chinese embroidery. So it's obviously this, blending of the two, which neither culture would have done on their own for their own markets. So it's a pretty strong indicator that this was intentionally for the Western market. So now we move into mature luxury, what I like to call mature luxury. So on the left, we have a photograph of Agnes again at the estate of Fettercairn. She's in a wool suit. It is practical, but it is also absolutely fashionable. She, as we've seen, loved visiting Fettercairn and spending time outdoors there. This suit was given her standing and her status, obviously and undoubtedly well made. And on the left-hand side is an advertisement from a catalog company called Bellis, Hess and Company. It's a catalog out of Illinois, and it's from the images from the fall-winter issue of 1916 to 17, which is the same basic date of the photograph. And so it demonstrates that, Agnes is absolutely sort of on point with fashion at this date, but also wanting to project an image of practicality and sort of pragmatism. She's doing, walking activities outdoors, and she's dressing appropriately for this. And now we have winter at Fettercairn. So the left-hand photograph is sort of the overall one. The right-hand photograph is a detail that I took of Agnes from within the first one. She's displaying smart and luxurious winter clothing with a plush or velvet coat and a very large fur muff. Both of these items would have simultaneously provided sensually pleasing textures. They would have been extremely soft and sort of smushy feeling, and so it would have granted her a great deal of pleasure to wear, in addition to keeping her protected against the elements and Canadian winter. Now, at the age of 40, in May 1921, at the age of 40, so even guess what is it? The antiquated calico, even more antiquated calico. Oh no. Agnes married Frederick Etherington, a doctor and a colonel in World War I, who would become the Dean of Medicine at Queen's. This photograph is of Agnes on her wedding day, holding her infant niece and namesake, Agnes Benedictson, the one who gave this speech, from which I read an excerpt. The photograph, however, and especially in this form here, does not do the gown justice, as we will see in the next slide. The gown is a complex confection of silk chiffon, expensive lace, silk satin with fur trim that we think might be rabbit, around the neckline, the hem, and the train. Unfortunately, none of the copious, and I mean copious, reporting on the wedding or events leading up to it in the local Whig Standard Society column mentioned where Agnes's gown came from. It must certainly, like so much of her clothing, must have been custom made for her. And despite its lavishness, the gown is not overly fashionable for 1921. The dress on the left is another wedding dress from 1920. Oh, seriously? Did I actually go that long? Sheesh. Okay. And is more representative of what fashionable brides were wearing at that date. Clearly, this was not to Agnes's taste. At 40 years old, perhaps she thought the new styles too young for her and or beneath her dignity. In fact, her wedding gown more resembles in silhouette and overall aesthetic her evening gown from 1912 and the more fashion-forward 1921 dress. In terms of Agnes's surviving clothing, this dress appears to mark a change in her approach to her wardrobe, away from up-to-the-minute fashionability and towards settling into her own style. And so that's what I would be talking about for the next few minutes. including this fabulous cocoon coat, which, although from the 20s and this period when she's, I said she's settling into her own type of style, still includes elements of fashion. The sort of metallic fabric on the front facings is a composite material of Egyptian motifs, so tying it in with the Egyptomania of that time. And then going into her extensive work with the Canadian Women's Foundation, and so the social events that would have been involved with that, but we'll jump ahead. So you can see there's a consistent silhouette here through her life, but we'll jump ahead to the portrait dress. The date that the portrait dress is made is unknown. It's the one that she wore for renowned Kingston Society portraitist Grant MacDonald in 1950. And while we do know that the dress and accompanying brown velvet hat were made by Montreal couturier Raoul Jean Foret, like I said, we don't know the making. The dress is elegant with smart details, such as the pleated front panel, hand-beaded collar, and neckline inset and back peplum. However, in a similar vein to her wedding dress, in 1950, the style of this dress was already at least 10 years out of date. That's what was in fashion around about 1950. And so there we have a comparison. However, the date that Agnes's green portrait dress was made is actually irrelevant. What matters is that in the face of the rage for Dior's new look, 70-year-old Agnes chose to have her likeness immortalized in a dress style with which she was comfortable, but which still conveys her social status and creative character. Agnes Etherington was a woman made up of equal parts conventional and unconventional. She took and inhabited her exalted place within Kingston society of her time. I think she enjoyed the many privileges of her position and met the attendant responsibilities with equal vigor. She was also, however, certainly her own woman with her own mind, who pursued her passions and determination to create something greater than herself, and always with her own sense of style. There.